it's impossible to follow that with anything that is an adequate response. But I do think, as Bob said, the work of John Kelly at Breandán is an attempt to put into physical form something of that response, and we'll hear and learn more about that later this afternoon. But it's a great privilege now to introduce the first of our historians to talk on this subject, and that is Professor Breandán Mac Suibhne from Ullscoil na Gaillimhe, who will be well known to some of you for his work on the famine. He has written a number of extraordinary authoritative pieces. I think The End of Outrage is the book that I think is really very striking on the cultural impact of famine, what it does to people, and he will talk a little about that in Skibbereen in the course of the famine. And he's also, I think it's true to say, Breandán, the person who has written for the Dublin Review of Books the article that has been most frequently cited in the history of the DRB. I think that is a statistic that bears scrutiny. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing will be for readers of the DRB to determine. I think it's a fantastic article. Anyway, without anything more from me, Breandán.
Dús bara bhhailm just buíthe sa gáil Simon agus le Victoria agus Connie agus Rory agus an Christe tacu as caithfeá hortú sa teachtain seo. Very grateful to be invited to the West Cork History Festival. History Festival summer schools are a distinctive part of Irish political and literary culture. I'm not sure of anything like this anywhere else in the world. It's a very unusual thing, and it's a very important part of our democracy that we have meetings of diverse company to debate, to have reasoned discourse about complex things in politics, literature, history, etc. And that it brings people, be they from public administration, politics, academia. It's always good to get the eggheads out of the ivory towers. It brings us all together, but particularly in community, and that we get to engage on these matters. So congratulations on your 6th year. It's an achievement, particularly in light of the last couple of years. I'll just show you this first. I like showing people this. These are the rules of a dance hall in North Donegal in the middle of the 20th century. And this is a reminder of a bleak period in our past. It's a period of grim poverty. It's a period of rigid clerical control and a real dark social conservatism. It's something that we have left behind. But this is the Ireland in the mid-20th century that was spat out of the Great Famine, a century after the Great Famine. So it's good to know that we've left this behind. But when we ponder that, we should always remember what the great novelist John McGahern told us, that people got on with their regular pagan lives as they had done since the time of the Druids. The Catholic Church wasn't the Taliban, and the people still danced. Okay? In deciding what I'd talk about today, I thought I'd talk about death. It'd been a nice, bright, sunny day in West Cork. and in deciding to talk about death, I was very conscious of the fact that we've all, who've read about the famine, who've thought about the famine, have heard how death, in a sense, died in the famine, that people weren't able to bury their dead. They weren't able to mourn their dead according to the traditional rituals that they would have had. One of the most enduring images to come out of the famine is the father or the mother burying their own child alone. And I think we've always been able to understand that intellectually, but certainly in the spring and early summer, the late spring and early summer of 2020, that was brought home for us when there were very necessary restrictions brought in by the state on funeral gatherings. And I think that was a very, very difficult time for people. My own father died at the end of March 2020, just before the lockdown proper came in. But I really did feel for people afterwards. And it's not the bereaved who felt the burden as such. I think it was communities felt that burden of not being able to bury their dead according to ritual. This is something that I remember reading long, long ago. It's an American poet, Thomas Lynch, who's also an undertaker on holidays in County Clare. But we've been burying dead since time immemorial, and we've always done it the same way. So when it was difficult for us to do it in our own recent past, I think there in that moment, there was a possibility that as we reflect on what our society has just come through, that we can, in a metaphorical sort of way, reach across time and engage with people who suffered through the Great Famine, who couldn't bury their dead the way they may have wanted. The history of the famine, I'd still like to say a few words about first. And the history of the famine has changed quite significantly over the last quarter of a century. Around the time of the sesquicentennial of the famine in the mid-1990s, there was a significant change. Hitherto, people had looked upon the famine in terms of what was done to and for the poor by landlords, charities, and the state. And by the mid-1990s, that started to change. The big questions were more or less settled about the number who died in the famine, the number who'd emigrated. Heroic phase of the scholarship was over, due particularly to the economist Cormac O'Grady. And people started to look at other things. It wasn't that they abandoned looking at what charities, landlords, and the state did for the poor, but they looked at other things. And among those things are what the poor did to and for themselves. And that included good things and it included bad things. You know, the poor fought for food. They rioted to get food. But the poor also fought each other for food. Some poor people took advantage of other poor people. So it's a dark period. It is a period, as Antisha was saying, that is quite grey. You know, it's very difficult to come to hard moral judgments when we start reading and talking about the famine. So we got Cormac O'Grady, the economist, writing about winners and losers in the famine. He's saying to us that there's more to the famine than event in Anglo-Irish relations, that in a famine, a society fractures on existing fissures, fissures of class, fissures of culture, gender, etc., etc. And a RTE journalist, Cathal Porter, gleaned an awful lot of material from the archives of the Irish Folklore Commission. And as he went through these stories collected from old people in the 30s and the 40s, he found, yes, they talked about the state agencies, the workhouses, the public relief schemes, but they also talked about land grabbing. They talked about people stinting food on children. They talked about neighbours stealing food and so forth. So it becomes a very, very dark story, but it's a fuller story than a simple vision of the famine from above. So that's a kind of a change that has been happening since then. But this type of thing was known. If I were to think of the little parish that I come from, the little part of southwest Donegal, certainly the folklore archive from there, the stories collected in the 30s and 40s, it has those type of stories. If I were to look at the novels of Patrick McGill, he talks about how one of the biggest business families in Glanties, the McDevitt's, he disguises them slightly, that they made money by being mealmongers during the famine. If I read a local history by a quite conservative schoolmaster, he would remind me that during the famine people bought up land and the people who were relatively poor advanced in society. Okay, so it wasn't that we were being told anything that people didn't know. So why did this come about in the 1990s, that this started to make its way into the mainstream historiography? It can be connected in some way to a major initiative at the end of the 1960s, which was the expansion of education, expansion of access to education. Because it's really only in the late 70s, early 1980s, that you got people of a working class, urban and rural background making their way into our universities in any great numbers. And that caused people to ask different questions, to bring different experiences to bear. And I think that contributed to it. For my own understanding of the famine, the book that Simon mentioned is not a book written by me, so I can praise it. It's a book that I edited with a friend of mine in Dublin. We discovered photostats of a manuscript in the Irish Folklore Commission and in the National Library of Ireland. One positive, one negative, photostats made in the 1940s. And they are of a memoir by a man called Hugh Dorian, who was born in Famine, North Donegal in 1834, and he died in the bogside of Derry in 1914. And in 1889 to 90, he wrote a narrative of how the famine transformed his community. When we were working on it, we only had the photostats. But since then, the original manuscript has come to light. Okay, Okay, the original manuscript has come to light. It sits in the living room of a dentist in Derry. The dentist is a brother of a person who was briefly prominent in Irish political life, Peter Casey, the former candidate for high office. But this is the manuscript. And this came to light from the photostats in the 50s. It was used by some historians and others, and then it was largely forgotten until Dixon and I went to look at it. but it is largely concerned with how ordinary people came through the famine, how this community came through the famine. It's written in a beautiful hand, a beautiful copperplate hand. And it turns on the famine. Now, Dorian was a Catholic, he was a nationalist, and he gives a nationalist account of the famine. He describes it in vivid details. He describes distended stomachs. He describes people turning blue, people turning orange from excess beta-carotene. He describes as well the situation of a grandfather who had food but wouldn't share it with his grandchildren. So it starts to bring home the horror of the famine. But it brings it home in its entirety when you look at something like this, or begins to bring it home in its entirety. He talks of the public works schemes. And he says this is where the government dealt out the successful blow, and it would appear premeditated. The great blow to take away human life, get rid of the population and nothing else. And he goes on to say it was next to slow murder. Now what's significant there is John Mitchell was the Almighty sent the blight, the English created the famine. He is saying it would appear premeditated. He's not saying it was premeditated. He was saying it's next slow murder. He's not saying it was slow murder. So he's essentially saying what the political scientist Brendan O'Leary of the University of Pennsylvania has coined the phrase genoslaughter, to describe what happened in the famine. So what my point would be, whatever you think of that, is we're dealing with a very sophisticated man who wrote this very extended account of the famine, and it's our longest account from a lower class perspective. Towards the end of his account, which is exceedingly moving, he says this: arising from death, emigration, and dispersion to all parts, the population soon dwindled away. Indeed, I hope it will not be in any way uncharitable to say it, but with the multitude also disappeared many turbulent and indifferent characters, who were only a disgrace to the good, to the honest, and to the well-doing. And if there was poverty, there was peace too. What he's saying there, I got rid of some bad bastards I didn't like. Okay, so that's exactly what he's saying there. And that starts to bring it home because the population of his place went down 20% in the course of the famine. At the time of writing, it was half what it had been 40 years earlier. But he goes further and he says, and I should say that is meaningful, or particularly meaningful, because he himself was a bit of a disgrace to the good, the honest, and the well-doing. He squandered opportunities for self-advancement. He drank heavily, was in trouble with the law, fell out with his landlord and his priest before moving into Derry. In Derry in 1899, December 1899, his wife and his daughter were arrested in Waterloo Place for public drunkenness. They were taken to the barracks, Waterloo Barracks. The wife was released to go home and fetch the daughter, and the wife fell drunk into the foyle and drowned. So that's the tier of society that this comes from. So when somebody at that level of society is saying this, it gives you pause for thought. But if he got rid of his people he didn't like, there were some people who remained. And he excoriates those who pulled themselves up during the famine. Here he is saying that people give out about the landlords, but often a man's neighbour is just as pitiless a tyrant as any man. Okay, which is an interesting comment to reflect upon. Vast amount of land changed hands during the famine. Some people got land, some people lost land. Okay. And this loss of land through the acquisition of land, I have to be careful how I phrase this, the acquisition of land during the famine is something that I tried to explore in a book I published a few years ago called The End of Outrage. And it centres on this building here, which is Bay National School. It's 12 feet by 22. There were 100 kids on the roll of that building in 1845. It's a single-roomed school, thatched roof, mud floor. It was valued in the middle of the 1850s at 15 shillings, when the typical house in that place was valued at 5. So it gives you some sort of sense of the conditions in which people lived. But their houses probably looked like that. This is one of them. The room on the right is an extension at the beginning of the 20th century. The original house was between the two chimneys, except there were no chimneys and there were no windows. And it would have had a thatched roof and had been singled room. Animals would have gone to the left, people to the right. So it looked like that. But that school in 1855 had a young schoolmaster called Patrick McGlynn, who turned informer on a secret society called the Molly Maguires. And all his correspondence with the authorities survives. There's this. Okay, it's in our National Archives, a very important national institution, housed in a biscuit factory. Sly. But there's a great story can be told in it of the constabulary coming from Glenties over to the little townland of Bea on the basis of these letters from Patrick McGlynn to lie in wait at the holding of a farmer called James Gallagher, who the Molly Maguires proposed to attack. Okay, and you can see it's a very small place. And I was able to explore through that, like the ends of that wave of political violence during the famine, how that wave of political violence came to an end in the 1850s, and how that related to the ebbing of outrage and the sense of moral indignation at the fate of the rural poor, and also how some people's outrage at what had been done unto their people in the famine came in time to end. But the question I had to ask was, why did the Molly Maguires want to attack James Gallagher? And we'll get to that in a second, but some of you might enjoy this. Not everybody in Donegal thinks the famine was a long time ago. A little girl in 1996 won the Ulster dancing competition, and due to an error in the local notes of the Donegal Democrat, it was reported that a relative of her father was a rate collector in Gweedore 150 years ago. Okay? So if you write about the famine in Ireland, it can be quite difficult. Like, it's easy for an English historian to compare his method to that of a detective looking for clues, or an Italian historian to compare the role of the historian to a judge. But if you're a historian of Ireland, you realise that some people look at you not as the judge or the policeman, but as the most nefarious figure in the entire criminal justice process, the informer. And historically in Ireland, the cropping of ears, the severing of tongues, well, that was the stigmata on the body of the informer, because you'd broken the golden rule, you haven't heard and you never tell. But I've survived intact so far. Okay, but I wanted to see, why did they want to attack James Gallagher? So I went to a source some of you who do your family history will be familiar with, called Griffith's Valuation, and I mapped the data. And that's what James Gallagher held in the middle of the 1850s, all marked in red. If you went back to just before the Great Famine, that's what he held. Okay? So in a very small place, James Gallagher rapidly increased his holding. That grey area, there was a family named Mulhern. Everybody there was a tenant. He paid the passage of the Mulhern family to America, and he became tenant of their land. And then in the early 1850s, in the yellow area, there was a widow named Nancy Suibhne. She was heavily in debt since the famine. He cleared her debt and obtained 50% of her land. On the light green area, there was a fellow called Pat Kennedy. He was a hard drinker. He was heavily in debt to James Gallagher. James Gallagher acquired 66% of his land, okay? And he became one of the largest landholders in West Donegal and the top 8% of landholders in the district. It wasn't resentment of him being a big landholder that caused the Molly Maguires to want to attack him. It was because he had subtenants, and he proposed and did clear his subtenants. He was a nasty guy. Despite being a very wealthy man, he let his own father go to the poorhouse. Okay? So that's kind of what I explored. That's kind of land from which people were evicted and so forth. And why this, I suppose, garnered some attention is that I'm a direct descendant of widow Nancy Suibhne and a direct descendant of Pat Kennedy, the hard drinker. My paternal grandparents were a Kennedy and a Suibhne. And so this made for interesting conversation. I remember chatting to my aunt about it, and I mentioned, geez, I never knew that he let his father go to the poorhouse. She says, tell us something we don't know. And I said, do you not want me to write about it? Oh, no, you should, just not in our time. Okay? But in trying to figure out, put this in some sort of context, how did people get over it? And I think it was the scale of change that happened in the wake of the famine was critical to it. That people were walking away from the dead. They were doing so literally through mass migration, but also, as Bob Geldof said, they were doing so culturally, figuratively through cultural change. They were changing the way they worshipped their God. They were starting to go to mass. They were changing the language they spoke, the customs they had, and so forth. So the past was becoming very distant to them. They were walking away from the dead. And that brings me to the dead and death, which is a subject that's attracted attention. Those of you involved in politics will notice a man named Vincent Brown has written a book about death, which mightn't surprise you. But these are two Harvard professors, and the book on death in the Civil War is a particularly good read for anybody interested in history. It's got the best table of contents I've ever seen. Lovely, clean table of contents. But you can see the range of topics that can be covered in it, as Drew Gilpin Faust, the president of Harvard, tries to contemplate what death meant during the American Civil War. And if we were to do something like that on Ireland, we can come up with a whole range of topics that we could explore. It'll be interesting in the coming years to see historians do a bit of that. Okay. Okay, but what I'd like to talk about now is something, because we are in Skibbereen, is a man named Dan Donovan. And Dan Donovan was a doctor on North Street, Skibbereen. And he wrote two very important series of articles in 1846 to 1848 on his experience of the famine. And I'll just read you a kind of paraphrased account of his encounter with a woman. It was, Dan Donovan thought, as if the grave had that moment vomited her forth. It was Friday, 22nd January 1847, cold and wet, with a gale rising. Her married name was Keating. She was from Letcher, 2 miles from Skibbereen, and she'd crawled those 2 miles to the house of Donovan, a 39-year-old dispensary doctor. She was suffering from malignant fever and emaciated to the utmost degree. And Donovan, though a compassionate man, was afraid that she would infect his own children. He handed her a shilling and told her to leave his door. "I don't want this," she said of the doctor's shilling. "I want to get my boy buried. He is dead these 11 days. He died in 2 days after his father. I got the sickness myself. My 2 children are dying. No person will go to them to give them or me a drink of the cold water. And I got up in the fever today and put the corpse in a ditch. And I came to you to get it put in the grave, that the dogs may not eat it." That evening, Dan Donovan of North Street and Jerry Crowley, the Skibbereen apothecary, went out to Letcher. The scene of misery appalled them. The mud floor of the hovel was one mass of filth, the rain pouring down freely from the rotten thatch. On the ground, which was a perfect cloaca, or sewer, lay 2 children, upon whose bodies the anatomy of the bones could be studied as perfectly as on a dried skeleton. And in the ditch, in front of the door, was a coffin containing the putrid body of a dead boy of 7 years old. Donovan asked the woman how she had procured the coffin. She told him that it was the shilling that he had given her to buy food that paid for the coffin. Neither she said, nor her other 2 children cared about the victuals now, as they forgot the taste of them. Donovan and Crowley began to dig a grave in the corner of a kitchen garden. That would be a vegetable patch. And none of the women's neighbours came near them. And so alone they finished that grave, or rather the hole, as Crowley phrased it. And there they buried that 7-year-old boy who had been 11 days dead in the hovel with his mother and siblings. It was 11 o'clock that night when they got back to Skibbereen. 4 days later, on Tuesday, 26 January, Donovan was going up High Street to attend a family in fever. Someone caught him by the coat, and turning around, he recognised the Widow Keating. She'd come into town to bury her daughter Mary, who had died the previous morning. But she had something else on her mind. "Doctor," she said, "won't you send for my boy? The pigs got into the field where you put him, and I fear they will root the grave. And as no Christian would come near me, I brought in little Mary myself to lay alongside of her father in the chapel yard." Donovan hired 2 men to remove the corpse of the 7-year-old from the garden and reinter it in consecrated ground. However, in going out to Letcher, they found that the body of the boy, then over 2 weeks dead, was in such an advanced state of decomposition as not to admit of it being raised by them. In other words, they refused to do it. The next day, the Widow Keating herself exhumed the putrid corpse, brought it into Skibbereen, and buried it with the remains of her husband and daughter. 7 days later, on Tuesday, 2nd February, the widow again met Donovan in the street and accosted him with a demand for another coffin for the last of her children and family who was then lying dead. She perceived a certain hesitation on his part. He'd already purchased coffins for 2 of her children and contributed towards the coffin for her husband. And so she implored him, in the name of the great God, not to let her fine boy that would be her help and support if he lived, be thrown into the grave like a dog. There was something so impressive, he wrote, in the manner and so awe-inspiring in the death-like appearance of this spectre-looking woman, that I yielded to her entreaties. The coffin was purchased. She placed it on her head, and I was about to leave the town when I again saw her. I remonstrated with this dying creature, who was during the whole of these melancholy scenes labouring under famine fever, and pointed out the risk that would attend her undertaking such a task in her weakly state. But the widow Keating disregarded his advice and walked home with the heavy coffin on her head. She reached her cabin door, fell to the ground before entering it, and died a victim, as Donovan put it, to her fondness for her family and reverential respect for their remains. In Letcher, Keating's neighbours, dreading contagion, would not go near her body, and so it lay outside her cabin door until the next day, when Donovan heard of her fate and sent a car for her remains and those of her son. He had the two of them laid with her husband, her daughter, little Mary, and her other son, to sleep in death, as he put it, with those whom she had so much loved in life. And he promised himself, when he had time, that he would have a headstone raised to this martyr to maternal duty, this humble heroine, so that her sad tale shall one speaking stone declare, from future eyes to draw a pitying tear. Now, Dan Donovan was to live another 30 years. It's not known if he ever raised that stone. Today, no monument can be found in Skibbereen to the Keatings of Letcher, the father who died on 9th January. Just clarify that for you. The father who died on 9th January, the mother who died on 2nd February, and their 3 children who died between those dates. Yet the doctor's account, through the doctor's account, the widow Keating's determination in extremis to see her children buried with some semblance of dignity, decency, her clutching at that which marks us out as human, survives the wreck of time. And so does the doctor's compassion. But no less conspicuous is the refusal of her neighbours to assist in the removal and interment of the dead. Now, that refusal shook Donovan as it shook Crowley. Crowley remarked on it in a letter to a friend in Cork. Yet it's very difficult to judge those neighbours. Malignant typhoid fever, which extinguished the starving family, was highly contagious. Indeed, 2 leading physicians would later calculate that in the year 1847 alone, 131 Irish medical men succumbed to epidemic and contagious disease, with the vast majority, 123, dying of fever. It's an extraordinary toll in a single year of a more protracted crisis from a profession that then numbered about 2,600 male practitioners. And it's all the more extraordinary as it excludes women working as matrons, nurses, and what we might now call home helps. Donovan himself later remarked of West Cork that almost every person actively engaged in the administration of relief to the poor was attacked with fever. And you can think too of the health services in the time of COVID. In any event, the neighbours' refusal of assistance to the widow Keating, the refusal even to dig a hole, like Donovan's initial concern that his family might contract fever from her, can be explained, can be understood. Moreover, although not necessarily all of those neighbours were in dire circumstances, many probably were. In 1851, the population of the townland of Letcher was 106 persons, down to half of what it had been in 1841. The number of houses was down from 34 to 17. And much of this winnowing of men and women and children by death, migration, removal to the poorhouse would have taken place in the 3 months before and after January 1847, when Daniel Donovan found that woman as if the grave had vomited her at his door. So refusal to assist somebody in distress seems only slightly less grievous than deliberately inflicting harm upon them. And in the years of the famine, poor people did inflict harm on persons similarly circumstanced to themselves, often by stealing small supplies of food. Houses and hovels were burgled. Hungry people were waylaid coming home from shops and soup kitchens. Bread was snatched from the hands of the starving. People murdered for food. This is a little incident nearby. One horrific incident outside Rosscarbery in West Cork in spring 1847 came to Donovan's attention. Men employed on the public works used to go to nearby houses to boil their breakfasts. On the morning of 4th March, Dennis Finn of Carrogaruff and his 12-year-old son Johnny took their breakfast in Corran in the house of Judith Donoghue. She was living with 3 children, Johnny, who was 14, Mary, who was 6, and Jerry, who was 4. Her husband had died on the 23rd of February, a few weeks earlier. The Finns, who lived only about 2 miles away, had been breakfasting with them for about 9 or 10 days. After the Finns had left that morning, the widow took Johnny with her to get soup in exchange for turf from Richard Hayes, the rector at Ballyroe. The soup was not ready when they arrived, and so she sent the boy home. There, the 14-year-old found the 4-year-old Jerry dead, face down near the door, and Mary dead on her back in the corner near the fireplace. Their throats had been cut with the widow's own knife, which was found under Mary's poll, which is a phrase for the back of the head. Judith would later say that her head had been cut off, all to a little bit of the poll behind. Jerry's throat was cut from ear to ear. Missing was a small grey bag of oatmeal flour that the widow had locked in a box with a cake of bread that she'd made that morning. The box was in pieces on the floor. Also missing was a pair of shoes that belonged to her late husband. 8 days later, Johnny Finn, 10 or 12, was arrested in the poorhouse in Skibbereen. Philip Somerville, a magistrate, with Constable Michael Jordan, translating from the Irish, took a statement from the child who spoke no English. Again, this is all in our National Archive. You might be able to read it there. He said that the 2 children were there by themselves, that he found a knife in the house, and with that knife he killed both children, that he took 2 quarts of flour that the little girl told him was in the house, and the bag that was into his own house, and that his family ate of it with him. But he did not tell where he got it. He further states that he killed the 2 children to get the flour as he was hungry. He first killed the little girl and afterwards the little boy. He is a most wretched-looking, half-starved creature, Somerville remarked when forwarding this confession to Dublin, and what to do with him I'm at a loss to know. Finn first came to trial in April 1848 when it was abandoned when a juror took ill. The following July, he was acquitted of murder, his attorney having created a reasonable doubt as whether the emaciated child would have been capable, would have had the physical power to kill the Donohues. He strongly imputed the murder to his father, Dennis, who that morning had been heard to ask the widow how much flour had she taken from the market. But the general impression, according to the newspapers, the general impression in the court was that the verdict was a proper one, the acquittal. And yet others entertained no doubts about Johnny Finn's capacity to kill. Before the case had even come to trial, Dan Donovan, the doctor, that charitable doctor, had said that he always regarded him as an artful designing knave. In any event, within 5 years of that boy's acquittal, there was no Finn householder in Carhugarov. Unless she had remarried, the widow Donoghue had no house of her own in Corran, and the daughter of Reverend Richard Hayes, the rector, to whose house she had gone that fateful morning to get the meal, the soup, his daughter was dead from typhoid fever. So the moral consequences of hunger and disease troubled Donovan. The most singular effect produced by the horrors of the famine now raging, he wrote, is the severance of the ties of consanguinity which it has caused, and the destruction which is induced of the ardent domestic affections that form perhaps the strongest trait in the character of the Irish peasant. Okay? And he refers to an incident in which a woman named Driscoll came to get medicine for her husband, who was affected with road sickness. While I was prescribing for him, he wrote, this woman entered the surgery and begged that I would give her something for a sick child, upon which the first female alluded to exclaimed, bad luck to them for children. I have 5 of them sick, and I would think myself lucky if they were all dead before morning. Donovan remonstrated with this woman for her cruelty, apparent cruelty, but she persisted. This time 12 months ago, I would as soon lose my heart's blood as one of my children, but it's killing me now to see them starving and crying. And a year later, Donovan, reflecting on the storm of death that had raged through his district, was even more insistent on the moral consequences of famine. I have seen mothers snatch food from the hands of their near-starving children, known a son to engage in a fatal struggle with a father for a potato, and have seen parents look on the putrid bones of their offspring without evincing a symptom of sorrow. Such is the inevitable consequence of starvation, and it's unfair to attribute to inherent faults in our people the moral degradation to which they are at present reduced, and which is inseparable from a state of severe physical privation. And there lies the real brute reality of famine. It reduces people. It pushes them below the waterline of that which they had understood to be civilized behaviour. And so the widow Keating of Letcher answers Diogenes the Cynic, who asked why it mattered if corpses were not thrown over the city wall to be devoured by birds and beasts, until the day that she died at her own door, having borne home a coffin for her third and last child. That remarkable woman affirmed that the care which society accords its dead raises the living above the level of the dogs and the pigs that would have devoured the bodies of her children. So you could say that she who's numbered among the famine dead died undefeated. Now, death in this period, there's the cheerful stuff, huh? Here's another example of something. This is a woman called Johanna Fitzgerald, who went into an apothecary shop, a chemist shop in Kenmare in 1847, and offered to sell her suckling child. The apothecary sent for the constabulary, told the woman to come back in 15 minutes, sent for the constabulary, and had a conversation with her, which the constabulary transcribed. And he said, if I get this child, I'll dissect it. She says, I couldn't care less what you do with it once I get the money. And there's another case very like that in Youghal, in which people attempt to sell the body of their nephew. So there's horrendous things like that that are quite difficult. So death was everywhere at this period, and for many years after it. There was death in houses, hovels and huts, death in infirmaries, death in fever sheds, death in prisons, poorhouses, and there was death under the canopy of heaven on turf banks, roadsides, fields, ditches, drains. For sure, there was death in more comfortable surrounds. Contra John B. Keane's The Field, policemen and priests, clergymen of all denominations died in numbers, as did others who came into regular contact with the diseased poor. So doctors, nurses, workhouse employees, relief workers, even some landlords. In the town of Sligo, the matron, the master of the workhouse, the assistant master and the clerk all died of fever in a single week. The headmaster of Ballymena Academy caught fever attending the bedside of two of his parishioners in a hovel. But it's predominantly the poor for whom death came, stalking them in squalor beneath even the ragged poverty that was their everyday existence before that first blighted harvest in 1845. It did not come immediately. In the year after the harvest of 1845, few died. The poor held death at bay by disposing of livestock, by borrowing money, by getting foodstuffs on credit from mealmongers and going into arrears with landlords and rate collectors. But after that second, more catastrophic failure in 1846, death that had hitherto circled like a predatory animal attacked with vengeance. Now, death came with many names: dysentery, diarrhea, dropsy, most especially typhus and typhoid fever, all of which were, to a greater or lesser extent, famine sensitive. And death came too as epidemics of childhood diseases, consumption, and in 1849, cholera. Disease has ever been the great killer in food crises, less due to lowered resistance, a weakening of the defences of the undernourished body, than to increased transmissibility resulting from social dislocation. That is, poor country people leaving their homes, voluntarily or otherwise, to seek employment in towns and cities, their hygiene, the quality of their food, their water, their sleeping arrangements deteriorating, the inability to social distance, if you like. And that contributed massively to the spread of disease. The common louse and straw, which begging families slept on in barns and byres, spread fever. Contaminated food and water spread dysentery and diarrhea. But if disease was the great serial killer in the horror that engulfed Ireland in 1846, absolute starvation, want of food, want of the necessaries of life, insufficient aliment, hunger, was in all of Ireland's 32 counties a persistent handmaiden of death, approximate as well as an approximate contributor to mortality figures. So through the late 1840s into the early 1850s, inquests frequently reported stomachs and bowels that were completely empty. So what were they like, the famine dead? They're described as emaciated, withered, cadaverous, spectral, walking skeletons. Their legs and stomachs were often swollen, their cheeks sunken, their faces waxy. In January 1847, Dr. Charles McCarthy could testify at a coroner's inquest in Bantry that the people are now so emaciated that the young appear old. People will grow hair on their face during the famine. And he could tell too of how when he rode up to the hovel of Bridget Holohan at Ruska to perform post-mortems on two of her children, that his horse had jumped startled by the skeletal appearance of a boy who came out to hold it. The dead inside included Timothy, aged about 11 months, and Mary, aged 4.5 years, a perfect skeleton. In the days before death came, the dying tottered or staggered, or like the Widow Keating, crawled. Their eyes were languid, expressive only of mortal agony, or distended, and they had the gaunt, unmeaning, vacant stare of inanition. Their lips were blanched and shriveled. They gasped, groaned, moaned. Little Timothy Houlihan, the 11-month-old, died screeching for food. Often adults could hardly speak. They were insensible. Starving adult males, it was reported, could be very easily put to cry. Their skin was sometimes deadly pale, blue, green, yellow, and sometimes orange, again from the excess beta-carotene from shellfish. And at times when they were dead, it took the living so long to bury them, several weeks in some instances, that the corpses were black before the sod was pressed upon them. In places, hovels containing several putrefying corpses were simply tumbled and torched without removing the dead. And the body of a boy was left so long on the Newport Road from Castlebar that at the time it was removed in February 1848, it had partly melted away. What concerned these people in the days before death? Often they craved heat. Many times the bodies of the dead were found curled up on around the remains of a fire. Often they were thirsty. Often they were ravenously hungry. Some of the dead had recently devoured food offered by the charitable. Yet there are reports too of people having lost the taste for victuals, like the Keatings, and when given food, been unable to eat it. Some people fretted towards the end about being buried with their own people. Others that they be buried in a coffin. Others simply that they be buried. Owen Mulrooney of Cluneen near Drumcliff, County Sligo, cared only that his eyes not remain open after death. His wife had left with 5 children trying to get to England. She got as far as Enniskillen. And so when he thought death was near, he took himself to a neighbour's house as he felt lonely and was sure he would die without anyone to close his eyes. Others had ceased to care. So this is just some poetry that appears in the paper. The whole thing is permeated by accounts of death and how shocked people are by the inability to bury the dead according to ritual. That's a list of coroner's reports from County Meath. Again, all this stuff is in the National Archive. This is a sad little story. James Noonan, a labourer, and his wife left 9 Mile House, Tipperary, walking in the direction of Clonmel, which is about 14 miles distant. For 2 days, they subsisted on a single turnip. They called at different houses seeking food, but everywhere they were blankly refused. And at Kilcash, they gave up all hopes of success. They lay down on the road to die. So she woke, he didn't. And the good people of Kilcash had a whip around to send her back to 9 Mile House, which is what passes as charity in Tipperary. So predictably, the weakest, the most dependent in society were disproportionately represented among the dead. Infants and elderly people died in great numbers. And so too one has the impression were the ill and infirm, what we would now call people with underlying conditions. Unmarried mothers, deserted wives and their children, fallen women, beggars and hawkers. But such types were just the most vulnerable in the vast underclass of Irish society, comprising cottiers, labourers, smallholders and artisans that death ravaged in from autumn 1846. There is now a number for the dead. That number is at least 1 million. A round number invites suspicion. And this round number invites particular suspicion because it was used during the crisis itself. As early as February 1847, 1 million must perish was the headline in a Belfast newspaper. The 3 distinct statements by government ministers pointed, it said, to the fearful conclusion that 1 million of human beings should be sacrificed to state expediency. Others came up with the same number during the crisis, some higher numbers. In 1848, Daniel Donovan of Skibbereen, he estimated the previous year alone 1 million people had fallen victim to fever, dysentery and starvation. In truth, or to be precise, 1 million is shorthand for 1.08 million. And it is a really, really good number, a scholarly lower bound estimate for the scale of the crisis as measured in death. It's based on careful, sophisticated analysis. A number produced by carefully sophisticated scholarly analysis is a late phenomenon. For over a century after the famine, estimates of its toll were essentially guesses. It was only in the early 1960s that there was a serious attempt to calculate the level of excess mortality. A Welsh geographer, Stuart Cousins of Swansea, came up with a figure of 800,000. That number did not gain wide acceptance. In 1977, a prominent English demographer, Michael Flynn, pegged the death toll at 1.5 million. And in 1981, University College Dublin's Mary Daly, she threw out the figure of perhaps 500,000 people in her social and economic history of Ireland. Now, her method is not clear, but it's kind of David Drum School of Economics. So the game changer in finding a good number for the famine dead was a Dutch economist, Joel Mokier of Northwestern University, who, using clearly explained methods, came up with a range of 1.08 to 1.49 million. And the key component for accounting for the difference, the 1.8 to 1.49, is how you compute the number of averted births that would have taken place in the course of the famine. Later in the 1980s, Phelan Boyle and Cormac O'Grada, using different methods, came up with a very similar range. Okay, and there's a great irony here. And the irony is that this range of, say, 1.08 million to 1.4 million, if you had read nothing but two canonical texts in Irish nationalist discourse, if you had read Michael Davitt estimated, he said, it is estimated that the death toll was 1 million. John Mitchell, the young Irelander, he fixed it at 1.5 million. So if you'd read nothing but them, you'd have had the broad range. So I think a fair-minded person would have to ask, well, what was our revisionist moment about in the 1970s and 80s when perhaps 500,000 was the figure thrown out? Just read you one last little thing related to Skibbereen, and it's by the Republican leader Jeremiah O'Donovan Russa. To go back to a word that was used by Daniel O'Donovan, it's the word reduces, that famine reduces people. You eat food that isn't human food. You don't dispose of the dead. You don't bury the dead the way the dead are supposed to be handled. Decades after the famine, O'Donovan Russa was a guest in Tom Curley's hotel in Troy, New York. Curley was a native of Ballinasloe, County Galway. The two men fell to talking of the bad times. Curley asked him if he ever felt the hunger. I told him I did not, Russa later wrote, but that I felt something that was worse than the hunger and that I felt it still. And that was the degradation into which want and hunger will reduce human nature. I told him of a Sunday evening in Ross when I went home to my dinner and my mother had no dinner for me. I told him of how I had 1 penny piece in my pocket. I told him how I went out and bought for it a penny bun, and how I stole to the back of the house and thievishly ate that penny bun without sharing it with my mother and my sister and my brothers. I am proud of my life, one way or another, but that penny bun is a thorn in my side, a thorn in the pride of my life. It was only 4 ounces of bread, for bread was 4p, 8 cents a pound at the time. But if I ever feel any pride in myself, that little loaf comes before me to humble me. It also comes before me to strengthen me in the determination to destroy that tyranny that reduces my people to poverty and degradation and makes them what it is not natural for them to be. I know it's not in my nature to be niggardly and selfish. I know that if I have money above my wants, I find more happiness and satisfaction in giving it to my friends who want it than in keeping it. But that penny bun affair clashes altogether against my own measurement of myself and stands before me like a ghost whenever I would think of raising myself in my own estimation. I suppose it was the general terror and alarm of starvation that was around me at the time that paralysed my nature and made me do what I am now ashamed to say I did. Now, Russa had been born in 1831 in Reenascreena near Rosscarbery. A single townland, a few hundred yards, lay between his home place and Carhugarif, the home to Johnny Finn, the boy who, when employed on the public works in 1847, was alleged to have killed the Donoghue children for a bag of meal. That winter, in 1847, Russ's own father, Dennis, had been working as a ganger on the public works, making a new road through Rowry Glen he'd taken ill, and the 15-year-old Russa had taken his place on the works on 25th March. When word came that he was wanted at home, and there he'd learned that his father had died. So he worked right beside the Finns. But later that year, O'Donovan's Russa's family were evicted, and the person who evicted them was the mother of Dan Donovan, that great charitable figure of the famine in Skibbereen. Thank you.